In 1942, German railways carried freight in two directions. One direction moved supplies toward armies fighting on multiple fronts. The other direction moved people toward camps and killing centers in the east. When German logistics officers requested more rail capacity for military supplies, they were told that certain transports had priority that could not be interrupted. Those transports carried no ammunition, no food for soldiers, no fuel for tanks. They carried people deemed ideological enemies. The Nazi regime had made a choice. Ideology would take precedence over military necessity. At first, the impact seemed manageable. Germany was winning. Resources appeared sufficient for both objectives. But as the war intensified and resources grew scarce, this priority never changed. By 1944, German armies were starving for supplies while rail networks remained committed to ideological programs. Trainloads that could have carried ammunition to the front instead carried out Hitler's racial agenda. Manpower that could have built defenses or served in combat units instead staffed an enormous infrastructure of camps, security forces, and administrative apparatus serving no military purpose. The diversion was not trivial. Thousands of trains, millions of man-hours, vast quantities of resources flowed toward ideological objectives while military needs went unmet. Professional military officers recognized the problem but were powerless to change priorities set at the political level. The decision to prioritize ideology over resources was not made in a single moment. It was embedded in Nazi thinking from the beginning. But its consequences only became fatal when Germany faced resource constraints. In a war of attrition against enemies with superior industrial capacity, every resource mattered. Germany could not afford to waste any. Yet the regime systematically diverted resources from military to ideological purposes, treating racial policy as more important than military victory. This choice, maintained consistently until the final collapse, contributed significantly to German defeat. It was strategy subordinated to ideology with catastrophic results. By mid-1942, Germany faced a fundamentally different war than it had planned. The quick victory in Russia had not materialized. German forces were locked in brutal attrition warfare across a 1,000-mile front. In North Africa, Rommel's supply lines were stretched beyond sustainability. The Atlantic War was draining resources. Strategic bombing of German cities was beginning. Germany needed to maximize every resource to sustain operations on multiple fronts simultaneously. Professional military planners understood that efficiency in resource allocation would determine whether Germany could continue fighting. Every ton of steel, every gallon of fuel, every available worker had to contribute to military effectiveness. There was no margin for waste. Yet even as military pressure intensified, enormous resources flowed toward non-military ideological programs. The infrastructure to implement Nazi racial policies required extensive organization. Railway systems, administrative personnel, security forces, construction materials for camps, supplies for the apparatus, all of this consumed resources that had alternative military uses. Economic planners presented calculations showing the cost. Military logistics officers documented the impact on supply networks. The numbers were clear. Germany was diverting significant capacity toward programs that contributed nothing to military victory. In a total war economy where every resource should support the war effort, this represented strategic insanity. The diversion was not hidden from leadership. Hitler received reports on resource allocation. He understood the military costs. But he viewed ideological objectives as equal in importance to military victory. In his worldview, the war was being fought not just for territory or security, but to achieve racial reorganization of Europe. If Germany won militarily but failed to complete this reorganization, the victory would be incomplete. This perspective made ideological programs non-negotiable regardless of military cost. Professional military and economic officials who suggested modifying priorities were ignored or dismissed. The regime's ideological commitments would not bend to military necessity. This rigidity would prove fatal. Within Nazi leadership, ideology was not separate from politics, it was the foundation of political legitimacy. Hitler's authority rested partly on his role as prophet of racial ideology. Party officials derived power from implementing ideological programs. The SS had built an empire around racial policy. For these actors, abandoning or reducing ideological programs would mean surrendering political position and purpose. When military officials suggested reducing resources allocated to racial programs, they were not just challenging operational decisions. They were challenging the political foundation of the regime itself. This made such suggestions politically impossible regardless of their strategic merit. Himmler, who controlled the SS apparatus, was particularly insistent that ideological programs continue at full scale. He argued that racial reorganization of Europe was the war's ultimate purpose. Military victory without achieving racial objectives would be meaningless. He had Hitler's complete support on this position. Together, they ensured that resources for ideological programs were protected even as military allocations were cut. When the Wehrmacht requested additional railway capacity in 1943, Himmler successfully argued that scheduled transports to camps could not be interrupted. The military request was denied. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Ideological programs maintained priority even when military operations suffered as direct consequence. The political environment also prevented honest discussion of costs. Officers who raised concerns about resource diversion were accused of lacking ideological commitment. Economic officials who presented data showing the military impact were marginalized. The regime created an atmosphere where acknowledging the trade-off between ideology and military effectiveness was politically dangerous. This meant decisions were made without full consideration of consequences. The true cost of ideological programs in military terms was never officially calculated because doing so would have required questioning their priority. Policy was driven by political and ideological considerations. Strategic military analysis was subordinated to these priorities. In war, this approach guarantees defeat. The resource diversion was quantifiable. German railways moved approximately 1,400 trains to camps and killing centers in occupied Poland between 1942 and 1944. Each train required locomotives, railcars, fuel, and track time. Railway analysts calculated that this capacity could have moved approximately 3 million tons of military supplies to the Eastern Front. That amount of supplies could have sustained additional divisions, improved defensive positions, or enabled offensive operations. Instead, the capacity was used for ideological purposes. When the Sixth Army was encircled at Stalingrad in late 1942, Luftwaffe transport aircraft attempted desperately to supply them by air. Meanwhile, railway capacity that could have been used for a ground supply effort was committed to transports serving ideological programs. The numbers were stark. Resources existed. They were allocated elsewhere. Manpower diversion was equally significant. The SS employed approximately 200,000 personnel in camp administration, security, and related functions by 1943. These were not elderly reserves or disabled veterans. Many were fit men of military age. Security battalions that hunted resistance in occupied territories numbered in the hundreds of thousands. These forces were used not for military operations but for implementing ideological programs and controlling occupied populations deemed racially inferior. If a fraction of these forces had been redirected to combat units, Germany could have fielded additional divisions on the Eastern Front. Professional military planners made these calculations and presented them to leadership. The response was that ideological security had equal priority to military operations. Manpower would not be reallocated. Material resources told the same story. Construction materials for camp infrastructure could have built defensive fortifications. Fuel used by security forces could have supplied armored units. Administrative capacity managing deportations and racial policies could have processed military logistics. The cumulative diversion was enormous. Germany was fighting the world's largest economies while voluntarily reducing its own resource efficiency by significant percentage. Economic rationality demanded concentration of all resources on military victory. Ideological commitment prevented this concentration. The mathematics were simple. Germany chose to weaken itself militarily to pursue ideological objectives. In war, such choices have predictable consequences. Some German officials recognized the strategic problem and attempted to change priorities. Albert Speer, appointed armaments minister in 1942, pushed for total war economy where every resource served military production. He documented how ideological programs consumed resources needed for weapons manufacturing. He presented data showing that labor being used for non-military purposes could increase arms production substantially. His proposals included reducing resources allocated to racial programs and redeploying security forces to military service. Speer argued that Germany faced existential military threat and needed absolute prioritization of military needs. His logic was sound. His data was accurate. Hitler rejected the proposals. Ideological programs would continue at existing scale regardless of military cost. Economic ministries also raised concerns. Reports from 1943 documented specific cases where military operations suffered due to resource allocations toward ideological programs. One report noted that fuel shortages affecting panzer divisions coincided with continued fuel allocation to security forces conducting anti-partisan operations in rear areas. These operations were driven more by racial ideology than military necessity. Another report showed railway congestion problems that delayed military supplies while transports for ideological purposes maintained schedule priority. The pattern was clear across multiple sectors. Resources existed but were allocated based on political and ideological rather than military priorities. Officials who compiled these reports hoped data would drive policy change. It did not. Military logistics officers were particularly frustrated. They watched supplies delayed while rail capacity was committed to non-military purposes. They calculated that modest reductions in ideological program resources could significantly improve military logistics. Some attempted to work within the system, requesting that certain transports be rescheduled to reduce conflicts with military supply needs. These requests were usually denied at higher political levels. A few officers pushed harder, directly questioning whether ideological programs should take precedence over military necessity during existential war. These officers were removed from their positions. The message was clear. Resource priorities were political decisions, not military ones. Professional military judgment would not be allowed to override ideological commitment. Opposition to resource diversion existed within the German military and economic establishment, but it was systematically suppressed. Officers who raised concerns too vocally were transferred to less important positions or retired early. Economic officials who persistently questioned ideological program costs found their ministries sidelined from key decisions. The regime did not tolerate challenges to its fundamental priorities. By 1943, most officials had learned that career survival required accepting the existing allocation of resources regardless of strategic implications. Those who continued to push for change did so quietly and ineffectively. The institutional mechanisms that might have forced resource reallocation based on military necessity did not exist within the Nazi system. The military high command was particularly weak in this area. Unlike in democracies where military leadership could appeal to civilian authorities or even resign in protest, German officers served a dictatorship where the military was subordinate to political ideology. Hitler was both political leader and supreme military commander. There was no higher authority to appeal to. When military officers presented operational problems caused by resource constraints, Hitler's response was to demand greater willpower and sacrifice from troops. He refused to acknowledge that systemic resource misallocation was creating those constraints. Any officer who pressed the issue risked being labeled defeatist or accused of insufficient ideological commitment. In Nazi Germany, such accusations could be fatal. Some officers attempted indirect approaches. They would present requests framed to avoid challenging ideological programs directly. Instead of saying resources should be shifted from camps to military, they would simply request additional railway capacity without specifying source. These indirect requests were usually denied because decision-makers understood what was being asked. Others tried working through personal relationships with party officials, hoping informal influence might achieve what formal requests could not. These efforts occasionally produced small tactical adjustments but never changed strategic priorities. The fundamental allocation of significant resources toward ideological rather than military purposes remained fixed. By 1944, most military professionals had given up trying to change it. They focused on working within constraints they could not alter. The diversion of resources to ideological programs was systematic and well organized. In occupied Poland, extensive infrastructure was built and maintained for camps and killing centers. This required construction materials, ongoing supplies, transportation networks, and personnel. The administrative apparatus to manage the system employed thousands. Security forces to guard facilities and conduct operations numbered in the tens of thousands. All of this required resources taken from the general German war economy. The operation was conducted efficiently within its own terms. But from a military strategic perspective, it represented enormous resource consumption serving no military purpose during a war Germany was struggling to sustain. The railway system illustrated the problem clearly. German railway officials operated under strict priority schedules. Military transports were supposed to have high priority, but certain other transports were designated as equally high priority or higher. These included transports carrying people to camps. Railway officials were told these transports could not be delayed or reduced in frequency. This created regular conflicts. When military and ideological transports competed for limited track capacity, both claimed priority. The disputes were resolved at political levels, usually by requiring railways to accommodate both, even if that meant reducing other freight. Civilian supplies and economic freight were cut to make room. But the underlying conflict remained. Germany had committed its railway system to supporting both military operations and ideological programs simultaneously, without adequate capacity for both. Manpower allocation showed similar patterns. Young men were conscripted for military service, but significant numbers were diverted to security and police forces implementing ideological policies. The SS competed directly with the Wehrmacht for recruits. Units like the Einsatzgruppen and security battalions were staffed with men who could have served in combat units. The regime justified this by arguing that security in occupied territories was essential for controlling populations. But the scale of forces deployed exceeded any reasonable security requirement. They were conducting ideological programs that happened to involve security functions. The manpower cost was substantial. Germany was fighting a multi-front war with millions under arms, yet allocating significant military-age manpower to non-military purposes. The decision reflected ideological priorities overriding military necessity. By late 1942, the military consequences of resource diversion became apparent. The Wehrmacht was fighting on three major fronts and could not sustain all simultaneously at full strength. Supplies were insufficient. Reinforcements arrived slowly. Equipment shortages were worsening. Meanwhile, resources continued flowing to ideological programs at protected levels. Military commanders began reporting that operations were being constrained by logistics problems that appeared solvable if resources were reallocated. The Stalingrad airlift failed partly because German transport capacity was overstretched. Some of that capacity was committed to non-military purposes. The connection was not officially acknowledged, but field commanders understood it. In North Africa, Rommel's forces suffered chronic supply shortages that contributed to eventual defeat. Getting supplies to North Africa required shipping and railway capacity. Some of that capacity was being used for transport to camps rather than military freight to ports. Economic analyses later showed that relatively modest reallocation of transport resources could have significantly improved Rommel's supply situation. But such reallocation would have required reducing ideological program resources. That was politically unacceptable. Rommel himself was unaware of the specific trade-offs. He simply knew his forces were undersupplied while Germany claimed maximum war mobilization. The disconnect between rhetoric of total war and reality of resource allocation was growing. On the Eastern Front, the impact was more severe. The vast distances and poor infrastructure made logistics critical. German forces required continuous supply flows to sustain operations. By 1943, supply shortages were becoming routine. Units operated at reduced strength due to lack of replacements. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel shortages limited mobility. Professional logistics officers understood that some of these problems stemmed from railway capacity constraints. The railways were handling military freight but also maintaining regular schedules for ideological transports. When both competed, neither received optimal service. The cumulative effect was that German forces in Russia operated under unnecessary logistics constraints while fighting the largest and most important campaign of the war. The strategic absurdity was obvious to military professionals. They were powerless to change it. When confronted with evidence that ideological programs were consuming military resources, Nazi leadership offered consistent justifications. First, they argued that the war's purpose was not just military victory but racial reorganization of Europe. Achieving that reorganization was as important as defeating armies. Therefore, resources allocated to racial programs were being used for primary war objectives, not diverted from them. This logic treated ideological and military goals as equally important. Second, they claimed that security in occupied territories required the scale of forces and resources being employed. Without control of occupied populations, they argued, Germany could not exploit occupied territories economically. This framed ideological operations as supporting overall war effort. Third, they suggested that reducing ideological programs would undermine morale and political commitment within the party and SS apparatus. These organizations provided political support for the regime and helped administer occupied territories. Weakening them by reducing their primary mission would create political problems that could harm the war effort more than material reallocation would help it. Hitler particularly emphasized this point. He believed that maintaining ideological commitment was essential to sustaining Germany's will to fight. Practical resource concerns were secondary to maintaining ideological purpose. This reasoning was circular. Ideology was protected because ideology was important. The circular logic was never challenged within Nazi decision-making structures. These justifications convinced no one focused primarily on military effectiveness. But they served to shut down debate. Anyone arguing for resource reallocation had to challenge not just operational decisions but the regime's fundamental purposes. In the Nazi political system, that was impossible without risking severe consequences. So the justifications, however logically weak, functioned effectively to maintain existing policy. Resources continued flowing to ideological programs. Military operations continued suffering from constraints that had identifiable causes. The regime preferred systemic inefficiency to questioning ideological priorities. This preference was maintained consistently even as military situation deteriorated. By 1944, the justifications had become absurd. Germany was losing the war while maintaining resource commitments to programs contributing nothing to military survival. The regime would not change course. As the war intensified, the resource conflict worsened. Germany faced increasing military pressure on all fronts. The rational response would have been to maximize military resource allocation. Instead, ideological programs not only continued but in some areas expanded. In 1943 and 1944, deportations from Western Europe accelerated. This required additional railway resources at a time when railway capacity was a critical bottleneck for military supplies. Security operations in occupied territories intensified, pulling more manpower away from combat units. The resource diversion was increasing precisely when Germany could least afford it. Military professionals watched in frustration as scarce resources flowed to programs that weakened Germany's ability to resist mounting Allied pressure. The transportation crisis became acute. German railways were being bombed by Allied air forces. Capacity was declining. Yet the commitment to ideological transports was maintained. In spring 1944, Hungary's Jewish population was deported. This required approximately 150 trains over several weeks. The timing was catastrophic. Allied invasion of France was imminent. Soviet summer offensive was being prepared. German forces desperately needed supplies and reinforcements. Railway capacity was at premium. Yet substantial capacity was committed to deportations from Hungary. When the invasions came, German logistics were strained beyond capacity. Units could not be supplied adequately. Reserves could not be moved quickly enough. The connection between transportation allocated to deportations and inability to respond to military crisis was direct. The regime maintained its priorities anyway. Manpower shortages also reached crisis levels. By 1944, Germany was conscripting older men and teenage boys to fill combat ranks. The desperate need for manpower was obvious. Yet significant forces remained allocated to security and camp operations. The Waffen-SS expanded even as Wehrmacht divisions were under strength. Tens of thousands of men staffed camp systems while frontline units begged for replacements. Some military commanders requested transfer of security personnel to combat roles. These requests were denied. The men were performing ideological functions that leadership considered essential. Combat effectiveness was subordinate to ideological implementation. Germany was losing the war while maintaining this priority. The decision was maintained until the system collapsed completely. Germany's ideological resource allocation also affected its remaining allies. By 1943, Hungary, Romania, and other Allied nations were wavering in their commitment. They could see Germany was losing. One factor that might have kept them loyal was German military effectiveness. If Germany appeared capable of holding against Allied pressure, Allies might remain. But German forces were visibly weakening. Supplies were short. Operations were defensive. The reason was partly resource misallocation. Germany was diverting significant capacity to ideological programs while unable to properly supply Allied forces fighting alongside it. Hungarian and Romanian units on the Eastern Front were chronically undersupplied. Some supplies they requested were available in Germany but could not be transported due to railway constraints. The same railways were running ideological transports on schedule. The Allied nations noticed this disconnect. Their governments received intelligence about German resource allocation. They understood that Germany was prioritizing ideological programs over supporting Allied forces. This suggested Germany was not fully committed to joint military success. If Germany would not maximize military resources when facing potential defeat, how reliable was it as alliance partner? These perceptions contributed to Allied nations seeking exit strategies. Romania switched sides in August 1944. Hungary attempted to in October, though Germans prevented it temporarily. Among the factors driving these decisions was recognition that Germany's priorities were ideological rather than strategic. Germany was not fighting to win militarily. It was fighting to implement racial policies while trying to win militarily. Allies betting survival on German success found this deeply concerning. The loss of Allies accelerated German collapse. When Romania switched sides, Germany lost access to Romanian oil fields. fuel supplies to German forces dropped dramatically. This occurred at a moment when Germany needed maximum fuel availability to respond to Allied offensives. The loss was directly connected to Germany's failure to maintain Allied confidence. That failure stemmed partly from visible resource misallocation. If Germany had maximized military resources and sustained Allied forces better, Romania might have stayed loyal longer. The connection between ideological resource priorities and military coalition collapse was not direct but was real. Germany's choice to prioritize ideology undermined its strategic position in multiple ways simultaneously. The cumulative effect was catastrophic. Allied intelligence services monitored German resource allocation carefully. By 1943, they understood that Germany was diverting substantial resources to ideological programs. Allied planners initially struggled to believe the scale. It seemed irrational that Germany would voluntarily reduce military effectiveness for ideological purposes during existential war. But intelligence was clear. Railway monitoring showed regular non-military transports. Agent reports described extensive camp infrastructure. Signals intelligence revealed communications about ideological programs. Allied analysts concluded that Germany was fighting less efficiently than its resources permitted. This assessment influenced Allied strategy. If Germany was weakening itself through misallocation, Allied pressure should be sustained to exploit that weakness. The intelligence also shaped Allied propaganda and diplomatic strategy. The Allies publicized German ideological crimes partly for moral reasons, but also to demonstrate to neutral nations and wavering Axis partners that Germany was pursuing objectives beyond national defense. A country fighting for survival would concentrate all resources on military victory. Germany's maintenance of ideological programs while losing the war suggested its priorities were ideological rather than rational. This made Germany appear less predictable and less suitable as alliance partner. Allied propaganda emphasized this theme to potential German allies: Germany will pursue ideology at your expense. The message was effective because it was true. Germany's resource choices validated Allied claims. Allied military planning incorporated this understanding. Strategic bombing targets were selected partly to stress German transportation networks. The Allies' new railways were already strained by competing military and ideological demands. Additional bombing would push German logistics beyond capacity. This would force Germany either to reduce ideological transports or accept worse military supply problems. Either choice weakened Germany. The strategy worked. By late 1944, German logistics were in chaos. Military supplies moved slowly. Forces operated under severe constraints. Meanwhile, Germany maintained commitments to ideological programs until almost the end. Allied planners had correctly assessed that Germany would not rationally prioritize military resources. They exploited that assessment strategically. Germany's ideological rigidity became Allied advantage. Several moments existed when Germany might have reversed priorities. After Stalingrad in early 1943, it was clear Germany faced long war requiring maximum resource efficiency. Speer argued for total mobilization of all resources toward military production. His proposals implicitly included reducing non-military programs. Hitler rejected them. After Kursk in summer 1943, the strategic situation worsened further. Some military commanders believed this might force policy change. It did not. After D-Day in June 1944, Germany faced invasion from west while Soviet forces destroyed Army Group Center in east. Resources were desperately needed. Ideological programs continued. Even in final months when Germany was clearly losing, the apparatus remained operational and resourced. Each moment represented opportunity to prioritize military survival over ideological implementation. None were taken. The failure to reverse course stemmed from leadership psychology and political structure. Hitler personally identified with the ideological mission. Abandoning it would mean admitting the war's purpose was no longer achievable. He could not accept that. Himmler and the SS had built power through ideological programs. Reducing them would diminish SS influence and Himmler's personal position. He would not permit that. Party officials throughout occupied territories derived authority from implementing racial policies. They resisted any reduction in those programs. The political structure created multiple vested interests in continuing ideological programs regardless of military cost. No institution within Nazi Germany had both authority and motivation to override these interests. Additionally, reversing course would have required admitting previous decisions were wrong. Nazi leadership culture did not permit acknowledgement of error. Policy changes were framed as tactical adjustments in response to changing conditions, never as corrections of mistakes. Fundamentally redirecting resources from ideology to military would be impossible to frame as anything except admission that ideological priorities had been strategic error. Hitler's authority rested partly on perception of infallibility. Acknowledging major strategic error would undermine that authority. So the error was maintained until collapse. Germany would lose the war before admitting its resource priorities were wrong. The psychological rigidity of Nazi leadership was as important as ideological commitment in preventing course correction. Either way, the result was the same. Resources continued flowing to non-military purposes while Germany lost the war. By early 1945, Germany's resource position had collapsed completely. Allied bombing had devastated industrial production. Occupied territories were being liberated, cutting access to their resources. The German economy was disintegrating. In this situation, any remaining resources should have been concentrated on military defense. Instead, even as the regime was falling apart, ideological programs continued operating. In January 1945, death marches moved camp prisoners away from advancing Soviet forces. These movements required guards, organization, and transportation during Germany's final crisis. Railway capacity that could have evacuated German civilians or moved military supplies was used to move camp prisoners. The ideological priority was maintained literally until Germany surrendered. The commitment was absolute regardless of cost. The final months also revealed that the resource diversion had been even larger than apparent. As the system collapsed, the scale of infrastructure devoted to ideological programs became visible. Thousands of facilities across occupied Europe. Administrative networks employing tens of thousands. Security forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands. All of this had been sustained throughout the war. If these resources had been available for military purposes in 1944, Germany's defensive capacity would have been substantially stronger. Not enough to change the war's outcome, but enough to make Allied victory significantly more costly. Germany had voluntarily fought at reduced effectiveness for ideological reasons. The final collapse made the scale of this choice undeniable. What makes the story particularly striking is that the regime maintained ideological priorities even when defeat was certain. In March and April 1945, Germany was being overrun from east and west. Military resistance was collapsing. Yet resources continued supporting ideological infrastructure until Allied armies physically captured facilities. There was no moment when leadership said military survival was more important than ideology. The commitment lasted until there was nothing left to commit. From strategic perspective, this was insane. From ideological perspective, it was consistent. Nazi leadership valued racial ideology as highly as German national survival. When forced to choose between them, they chose ideology. The German nation paid the price for that choice. The regime proved willing to destroy Germany rather than abandon its ideological mission. Post-war analysis attempted to quantify the military cost of Germany's ideological resource diversion. Economists studied railway records. They calculated that approximately 7 to 10% of German railway capacity from 1942 to 1944 was devoted to transport serving ideological rather than military purposes. In a war where logistics were critical and railways were primary transportation, this was enormous inefficiency. If that capacity had been available for military freight, German forces could have been supplied substantially better. Operations that failed due to logistics constraints might have succeeded. Defensive positions might have been reinforced. The analysis suggested that the resource diversion reduced German military effectiveness by measurable percentage. Manpower calculations were equally revealing. Estimates suggest 200,000 to 300,000 German personnel were employed in camp administration, security operations primarily serving ideological objectives, and related functions. These numbers do not include frontline combat SS units, which served military purposes despite their ideological character. The 200,000 to 300,000 represented pure diversion of military-age manpower to non-military purposes. If these personnel had been available as combat soldiers, Germany could have fielded approximately 20 additional divisions. 20 divisions would have significantly affected operations in 1943 to 1944. They would not have changed the war's outcome given Allied material superiority. But they would have made German defense more effective and Allied victory more costly. Material resources were harder to quantify precisely, but the scale was substantial. Construction materials for camp infrastructure could have built defensive fortifications. Fuel used by security forces conducting ideological operations could have supplied armored units. Administrative capacity could have processed military logistics. The cumulative material diversion, though difficult to measure exactly, clearly represented several percentage points of German war economy. In total war where both sides mobilized maximally, several percentage points of inefficiency was strategic disaster. Germany was fighting the world's largest industrial powers with voluntary handicap. A handicap was chosen consciously and maintained consistently. No military organization can afford such inefficiency and expect victory. Germany proved this principle definitively. Germany's ideological resource priorities represented leadership failure at multiple levels. First, strategic leadership failed. Hitler and Nazi elite insisted that ideology take precedence over military effectiveness. This decision violated basic strategic principle: in existential conflict, survival is primary objective. Ideological goals that undermine survival are irrational. Nazi leadership subordinated national survival to ideology. Second, military leadership failed. Professional officers understood the resource problem but did not effectively resist bad policy. They raised concerns but accepted dismissal of those concerns. The Wehrmacht as institution did not protect German military interests against political interference that weakened military capability. Professional military judgment surrendered to political ideology. Third, economic leadership failed. Officials responsible for managing German war economy understood that resource allocation was inefficient. They produced analyses showing the costs. But they did not force policy change. Some tried. Most accepted their lack of authority to override political decisions. The result was that economic rationality had no effective voice in resource decisions. Fourth, administrative leadership failed. Millions of people in German civil service, local government, and administrative apparatus implemented policies they might have personally questioned. The machinery of state served ideological rather than strategic objectives because individuals within it followed orders without challenging fundamental direction. This diffusion of responsibility enabled catastrophic policy to continue despite widespread understanding that it harmed German interests. The leadership failure was systemic, not individual. The Nazi political structure ensured that ideology would override all other considerations. Individuals who resisted were removed. Institutions that might have checked ideological excess were systematically weakened or co-opted. The problem was not that particular leaders made bad decisions, though they did. The problem was that the system was designed to prevent good decisions. Ideology was embedded at every level. Challenging it meant challenging the regime's legitimacy. In a dictatorship where legitimacy is centralized in one individual, challenge is impossible. The leadership failure was built into the structure. Given that structure, the resource disaster was inevitable. This explains why Germany maintained self-destructive priorities until collapse. The system could not correct itself because correction required challenging what the system existed to achieve. Historians examining Germany's defeat have consistently identified ideological resource priorities as significant contributing factor. Not the only factor. Allied material superiority and strategic errors like invading Russia were equally important. But resource misallocation made Germany's situation worse than necessary. Professional historical assessment concludes that Germany fought World War II at reduced effectiveness because it chose to divert resources to ideological programs. This was not inevitable. Different leadership could have maximized military resources while postponing or reducing ideological programs. Nazi leadership rejected this option consistently. The historical record is clear. Germany prioritized ideology over military effectiveness. That priority contributed significantly to German defeat. Some historians argue that the ideological programs were so central to Nazi purpose that eliminating them would have changed the regime's nature fundamentally. In this view, asking whether Germany should have reduced ideological programs is equivalent to asking whether Nazi Germany should have been something other than Nazi Germany. The question becomes hypothetical because the regime defined itself through ideology. This argument has merit. But it leads to conclusion that Nazi Germany was structurally incapable of rational strategic decision-making. If ideology trumped survival, the regime was self-destructive by design. This interpretation suggests Nazi Germany was doomed regardless of military performance because leadership would not subordinate ideology to strategic necessity. Either interpretation leads to same practical conclusion. Nazi Germany made conscious choice to prioritize ideological objectives over military effectiveness. That choice was maintained throughout the war despite clear evidence of military costs. The choice contributed significantly to German defeat. Whether the choice was avoidable within Nazi ideological framework is an interesting historical question. But the fact remains that the choice was made and had catastrophic consequences. Germany lost the war partly because its leadership valued ideology more than national survival. This stands as a permanent lesson about the dangers of ideological rigidity in strategic decision-making. When ideology becomes more important than reality, defeat is inevitable. Nazi Germany proved this lesson at cost of millions of lives and total national destruction. The German experience offers clear institutional lessons. First, organizations must have mechanisms to prevent ideology from overriding practical effectiveness. Ideological commitment can motivate, but it must not blind leadership to reality. When ideology prevents rational resource allocation, the organization will fail. Successful organizations maintain balance between purpose and pragmatism. Nazi Germany eliminated that balance completely. Second, organizations need institutional checks on leadership decisions. When one individual or small group controls all decisions without challenge, catastrophic errors become inevitable. Germany had no institutional mechanism to override Hitler's ideological priorities. The absence of checks made disaster certain. Third, professional expertise must have protected voice in organizations. German military, economic, and administrative professionals understood the resource problem. But professional advice was systematically subordinated to political ideology. Organizations that ignore expertise in favor of ideology destroy their own effectiveness. Fourth, organizations must be able to acknowledge errors and change course. Nazi Germany's leadership culture made admitting mistakes impossible. Once committed to ideological priorities, the regime could not reverse course regardless of evidence. Organizations that cannot correct errors will eventually fail catastrophically. The inability to change course made Germany's resource disaster permanent. Fifth, short-term political considerations should not override long-term strategic interests. Nazi leadership maintained ideological programs partly for political reasons internal to the regime. These programs served no military purpose but were politically valuable to Hitler, Himmler, and party apparatus. Protecting short-term political interests at expense of long-term national survival was strategic suicide. Modern organizations face similar tensions between internal politics and external effectiveness. The German case demonstrates that organizations that prioritize internal political considerations over external strategic reality will ultimately fail. These lessons apply far beyond military history. Any organization can destroy itself through ideological rigidity, lack of institutional checks, suppression of expertise, inability to change course, and subordination of strategic interests to internal politics. Nazi Germany did all of these simultaneously and suffered total collapse. The lessons are timeless. Germany's choice to prioritize ideology over resources illustrates broader truth about power and purpose. Leaders and organizations face constant tension between ideological commitments and practical effectiveness. Ideology provides purpose and motivation. But ideology that conflicts with reality creates strategic blindness. Nazi Germany represents extreme case where ideology was valued more than survival. The regime would rather lose the war than compromise racial policies. This choice seems insane from outside perspective. But within Nazi worldview, it was consistent. The war was being fought to achieve ideological objectives. If those objectives were abandoned to improve military effectiveness, the war lost its purpose. Nazi leadership concluded that fighting for ideology and losing was preferable to abandoning ideology to survive. This perspective reveals deep truth about ideological systems. Once ideology becomes foundational to identity and purpose, questioning it becomes existentially threatening. Organizations and individuals will maintain ideological commitments even when those commitments ensure failure. But commitment is not rational calculation of costs versus benefits. It is identity preservation. Nazi leadership could not abandon racial ideology without destroying their sense of purpose. They chose to destroy Germany instead. This pattern appears in less extreme forms throughout history. Organizations maintain failing strategies because changing them would require admitting foundational beliefs are wrong. Leaders pursue self-destructive paths because altering course would undermine their authority. The mechanisms are universal even when consequences are less catastrophic than Nazi Germany experienced. The ultimate lesson is that ideology must be servant, not master. Purpose and principles are necessary for coherent action. But they must be tested against reality and adjusted when evidence suggests they are counterproductive. Organizations and leaders that cannot question foundational assumptions when evidence demands it will eventually fail. Nazi Germany failed catastrophically because it would not question ideological assumptions regardless of evidence. The regime valued ideological purity over practical success. This choice was fatal. Any organization, movement, or leadership that makes similar choice will suffer similar consequences. Reality eventually defeats ideology. The only question is how much damage occurs before reality wins. Nazi Germany maximized the damage by maintaining ideological priorities until total collapse. The price of ideological rigidity was absolute. Germany's decision to prioritize ideology over resources stands as permanent historical warning. The regime chose ideological commitment over national survival. It maintained the choice consistently despite clear evidence of catastrophic costs. Professional military officers, economic experts, and administrative officials understood the problem. They lacked authority to change priorities set by political leadership. The result was that Germany fought World War II voluntarily, weakened by several percentage points of resource inefficiency. In total war against enemies with material superiority, that inefficiency was fatal. Germany could not afford to waste any resources. The regime wasted substantial resources systematically. This choice, as much as any battlefield defeat, determined the war's outcome. The lesson transcends Nazi Germany's specific crimes. The principle is universal. Organizations that prioritize ideology over effectiveness destroy themselves. Leaders who refuse to question foundational assumptions when evidence demands it ensure failure. Systems that suppress professional expertise in favor of political loyalty become dysfunctional. Institutions that cannot acknowledge errors and change course guarantee disasters. These patterns appear throughout human history in varying forms and scales. Nazi Germany represents an extreme example where all these failures occurred simultaneously in pursuit of genocidal ideology. The result was catastrophe for Germany and tragedy for millions of victims. But the underlying mechanisms are not unique to Nazi Germany. They are human tendencies that appear whenever ideology overwhelms judgment. The historical record is clear and permanent. Germany chose ideology over survival. The choice was conscious, consistent, and catastrophic. Every institution, organization, and leader faces smaller versions of this choice constantly. Purpose versus pragmatism. Commitment versus flexibility. Ideology versus reality. The German experience demonstrates what happens when the balance tips completely toward ideology. The cost was millions of lives, total national destruction, and permanent historical infamy. The warning could not be clearer. When ideology becomes more important than reality, disaster follows. Germany proved this lesson definitively. The question is whether future leaders and organizations will learn from that lesson or repeat the error. History offers the answer. Humanity will learn the lesson again. The only question is the cost of relearning it.